As a popularizer and long miscredited inventor of the tone cluster, the achievements of Henry Cowell shaped the 20th century. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Henry Cowell. Cowell was born in Menlo Park, California, to parents who would have been considered extreme hippies had they been in attendance at Woodstock. The parents split up soon after Henry's birth, and he and his mother spent time extremely destitute. Cowell had little in the way of formal schooling and absolutely no formal musical education whatsoever, but he loved music, and he badly wanted a piano, so he worked odd jobs, and eventually he saved up enough money to buy a dilapidated little upright. Almost immediately after he got this upright, he began experimenting with different techniques, slamming his forearms on the keyboard and just doing all sorts of wild stuff. As mentioned in my video on tone clusters, Cowell didn't actually invent the thing, but he was a popularizer and coined the term, so he was seen as its main proponent. Up until this point, Cowell had been self-taught, but as a teen he started studies at UC Berkeley under Charles Seeger, husband of fellow composer Ruth Crawford Seeger, and themselves the parents of Pete Seeger. Seeger experimented with something called dissonant counterpoint, and his ideas of creating a uniquely spiky American style really resonated with Cowell. Cowell spent some time in New York where he met early tone cluster aficionado Leo Ornstein, before moving back to California and becoming involved in a cult not unlike the Theosophists of Alexander Scriabin. The leader of this New Age group was a man of Irish descent named John Varian. Varian was an influence on and the dedicatee of some of Cowell's earliest still-performed work, the Three Irish Legends for piano. In these three pieces, Cowell takes tone clusters to their practical limits to emulate the gods of pagan Irish mythology. The first of these pieces, the Tides of Manaunaun, depicts the god of motion acting before the universe began. Heady stuff for a teenager to be writing, and they remain probably his most performed works. He would, intentionally or not, misstate their date of composition as to make him seem like a more profound prodigy. Cowell's pioneering use of tone clusters cannot be overstated. In fact, the Hungarian composer Béla Bartók asked Cowell for permission to use tone clusters because they were considered such a unique symbol of his music that Bartók didn't want to come across as being a plagiarist. Like Leo Ornstein before him, this is the vehicle upon which he built his fame, and he toured around the country just beating the daylights out of every piano he could manage to get his hands on. But Cowell was not a one-trick pony. In fact, he pioneered so-called string piano techniques, where he'd take the lid off of a piano and reach inside and pluck and strum the strings inside a piano instead of playing them on the keyboard as usual. Also, due to the influence of Seeger, he became obsessed with rhythmic complexity. And in fact, these generated some of his most unique and most forward-thinking works. In fact, he wrote string quartets where each player was going at completely different rates of speed. The only way in order to play these is to have headphones and click tracks, which was obviously impossible at the time. These studies were essentially theoretical in nature long after their conception and publication, but they did have significant impact on later composers who would use rhythmic complexity in their pieces, such as Conlon and Caro for his player piano studies. Cowell even worked with Leon Theremin, the Russian inventor of the electronic instrument that bears his name, on what was essentially the world's first drum machine. It was known as the Rhythmicon and was beset with mechanical issues from the start and never really worked past proof of concept. But the idea was there, and they nearly pulled it off. Cowell became the de facto leader of a group of American composers who banded together to promote their cause. Cowell founded a periodical whose sole purpose was to publish pieces from ultra-modernist composers that big publishing houses were not so eager to print. It was a good idea in theory, but in practice it was not sustainable financially, and it would have folded had not there been a sudden influx of money from a certain composer/insurance millionaire, Charles Ives. Ives and Cowell became close friends, and it was a win-win situation. Cowell could get the money to keep his periodical going and disseminate works not just by Ives, but by other composers, and Ives finally found a way to publish his works without just plain self-publication. In fact, Cowell even founded a record label in 1934 for the same kind of new music, which, considering it was the height of the Great Depression, would have been completely impossible without Ives' funds. In 1936, disaster struck Cowell's life. He was arrested on a morals charge, and charged with basically being a child molester. No one really knows if he was guilty or not, and what happened is, at this point, a matter of total conjecture. But the fact of the matter is that Cowell pleaded guilty, whether or not he was, and was sentenced to 15 years in San Quentin. To anyone, the prospect of having to serve a decade and a half in any prison, much less notorious San Quentin, is a tough pill to swallow. Add on top of that Cowell's sensitive nature and the tendency for inmates to target fellow inmates who are accused of sexual crimes, and one might consider his career to have been over. But Cowell made the best of a bad situation. In fact, one might be tempted to say that he thrived in San Quentin. His summit was a violinist, imprisoned for writing bad checks, and he began churning out works for the prison band, of which he ended up as music director. He continued to write experimental works for various ensembles, he read voraciously, and taught music to anyone and everyone willing to listen. He became one of the most beloved inmates. Cowell was also afraid that his imprisonment would tarnish his reputation among his friends, but in fact, he had an almost overwhelmingly positive response. His friends were his strongest supporters, with up-and-coming radicals like John Cage whipping up enthusiasm for Cowell's release in new music circles. The only friend to break contact was Charles Ives, and this hurt Cowell greatly, but this was more than likely due to the influence of Ives' controlling wife Harmony, who was concerned about how the news would affect Ives' health at the time and wanted to keep him in the dark about the issue as much as possible. The Parole effort was headed by Sidney Robertson, who was a musicologist very interested in Cowell's work. Her tireless efforts and petitions earned Cowell parole after 4 years. Upon his release, the two married and they moved to the East Coast. For some time, Cowell was secretary for Australian composer and pianist Percy Grainger, but his main job after release was working for the Office of War Information, churning out pro-American sentiment in music. He was eventually given a full pardon, but the experience, as positive as it was in many ways, was still incarceration for 4 years, and his friends who knew him before and afterwards said that he was a very changed man. His music became much less radical, and he was afraid of speaking his mind, especially on political issues. Nevertheless, he worked as a musical ambassador for the United States government in the 1950s and traveled all over the world, including as far as Iran and Bali. These world music experiences shaped his later pieces. Despite health scares, he kept himself as busy as ever. He recorded an album as piano music, he edited Ives' pieces for publication, and continued to talk about music. His wife was afraid he was pushing himself too much, but he would have felt artistically worthless had he not pushed himself the way he did. Henry Cowell died in 1965 in New York State, finally succumbing to illnesses that had plagued him for the better part of a decade. His influence on music, both as professor and as a general scholar, cannot be overstated. From his early tone cluster and rhythmic experiments to his tireless work in promoting his contemporaries to his work as a musical ambassador. My longtime piano teacher actually once took a class with Cowell in counterpoint, and he said that Cowell taught them everything. Everything, that is, except counterpoint.